So hey everybody, I'm Luke. I'm here to talk about CSS in JS. I didn't actually make this excellent graphic. That's from a GitHub repo, CSS-in-js 101. I highly recommend it if you like the stuff I'm talking about this evening. Some of it's come from there. It's a really useful resource and goes through everything in really great detail. So to start with, CSS in JS. What does it do? Actually, sorry, I've skipped a slide. What is it? CSS in JS is an umbrella term for technologies which help you define styles in JS in a more component approach way. The idea was initially introduced by, I can't remember his name, VJEUX on Twitter in 2014. He was working on the React team at Facebook. And initially, he was using it to describe a way of doing inline styles and components, and it was very specific to React, but lots changed since then. There's now easily hundreds of different solutions in the space, and it's really exciting, growing really fast. Some people don't really consider regular sort of CSS-based solutions where you just import some CSS into your JS. But personally, it's all CSS in JS. It's wonderful. So it allows you to do inline styles, so write styles inline with your code that then go into inline styles on your HTML. Alternatively, it will throw it into a style tag up the top. And then some solutions do a bit of a mixture of both, kind of like Radium. And then there's some solutions like CSS modules that do a completely different thing, where it just generates a CSS file that you can serve alongside your website. So what does it do? What does that give you? It lets you dedupe repeated styles, inline critical styles. You get sort of natural code splitting, dead code elimination. You can do with some of the solutions out there static extraction. So you can compile it all before you actually serve anything to the client and just have some static files of CSS ready to go or get inlined in your head. And the best part of it all is that you don't actually have to do any of those things by hand. It's just part of all the solutions that are out there, which is really handy. Sorry. Oh, my clicker stopped working. CSS in JS, why am I up here talking about it? How do I know about it? I'll just give you a bit of a history with how I came to find out about CSS in JS and end up loving it. It's tremendous. So a bit over a year ago now, we had a fairly major project a couple of weeks out from launching. I've been playing about with Create React app in my spare time, and I came across this thing called styled components. It was really cool, a totally new way of thinking about styling for me. I hadn't seen it before. It let you write your styles inside your JavaScript and have them alongside your components. And also, if you have sort of templating as your flowing state through your templates, that could impact what styles are being created. You had real cool stuff going on. It was 3 weeks before major launch. Obviously, it wasn't accepted, and the answer was no. But we were having real issues with CSS at scale. Mandy gave an excellent speech last year about CSS at scales and some of the challenges that you have with that. Without going into all of the challenges, some of the problems that we were having with it, we had really good testing processes and procedures. We were using some of the best conventions out there, BEM, and these worked really well most of the time for our front-end devs with strong CSS domain experience and knowledge. But that wasn't all of us on our front-end team. There were JS people in there who hadn't really taken the time to understand CSS, didn't really know what they were doing. And it's really easy with CSS to let incorrect things slip through peer review. So we weren't fully protected, bad things still happened, and CSS and JS looked like it sort of offered some technical solutions. So we'd been talking about how we could make CSS easier for the broader team, how we could make component-based dev easier, how we could get the wider team engaged with styling, and what CSS solution would sort of offer our team the most for our code base. This was really handy. Mandy tweeted that last week, so I could just copy paste it into my presentation. Thank you. So we did a bit of research into CSS-in-js and how it would work, what it would give us, and we came up with the following things from spiking two of the solutions out there at the time. One was styled components, another one was glamorous, which was really new at the time. And we looked into a whole bunch of other ones out there. There's so many. This is what we probably should have come up with. We could serve any critical CSS. We could share knowledge and patterns across our people who had domain experience with CSS and JS and were really good with one another. They could work together a lot easier. There'd be no more class name and misspellings and getting frustrated for hours because there's just that one letter that you dropped somewhere. And less CSS misspellings. No more unused classes. You wouldn't have CSS files with class names that you don't really know where they're being used, and you'd have to do a really thorough search across your whole code base to work that out. And if you've got multiple code bases relying on one another, you've got no chance. We had component level styling enforcement. So as part of the technical solution, it enforced that you were only styling that component, and it made it hard to have styling sort of leak down. And we thought we might get some type safety with it. We were really big on TypeScript back then, and we just converted a couple of code bases and we're all excited and we're like, type safety in CSS, what a thing. We also thought we could get at a component level markup and CSS snapshotting. In reality, we actually came up with a table which had a whole bunch of random metrics, and I totally fluffed and said that we got all the things and we didn't get some of those things, but that's what we should have come up with. And then we lived in the happily ever after. It was really performant because we only had the critical CSS up the top. All sorts of problems you have with CSS just disappeared, and we didn't really focus too much on CSS performance and weight or anything like that for quite some time. Later down the track, we got fairly easily unit level visual regression testing for components. And I'll show you a bit later what that looks like, but that was just incredible. It's a game changer. If you're not using that now, look into it. It's incredible. We got some excellent cross-discipline collaboration between people who were traditionally very experienced with CSS and JS in some cases, and people who were only experienced in perhaps JS or CSS. We came up with some really great patterns and worked well together. It had excellent tooling from your editor, sort of getting autocomplete with CSS properties and all sorts of things there. And the community was really responsive and friendly. So if we ever had any problems with it, we could just go ask and we'd get answers within sort of a number of hours. And also sometimes when we had issues, I can remember there was one PR we opened up, we noticed something had landed and it broke something for us. So we opened up a PR, it was a really small change, and it landed within about a minute, which was phenomenal. And testament to what a great community is. So sort of explained a bunch of the benefits in broad terms. It's this umbrella thing that just talks about everything. Probably a bit confused. So the mental model, if you think about the CSS in JS, well, if you don't have CSS in JS, you've got CSS outside JS, which is essentially where you structure your markup for your application if you're talking about web. That's a function of your state, but for so long, styling's sort of been, it's kind of a function of your state, but you've also got just these giant style sheets that you've got from somewhere else that are just getting thrown in, and on any one page, the styles that are available really have nothing to do with the URL or if the user's logged in or anything like that. It's also sort of class names and whatnot. It's all sort of a bit untethered there. Once you go into CSS in JS, both your structure and your style become a function of your state. So based on that particular URL and whatever other characteristics of that page, users logged in or something else, they've got something in their cart, both the structure, the markup is determined by the state, and also every single piece of CSS, every style rule that's been generated is a function of the state. And that makes it really easy to do things like server-side rendering and critical CSS and all of those awesome things that it is really useful for. So, as I said earlier, it's an umbrella term. It refers to a lot of things. In particular, the bit that I'd like to try and sell you on and get excited about this evening, the thing I find most exciting about it is where you use it with component systems such as React. And so let's have a look at some of those. So using styled components, and there's an enormous amount of frameworks that do it. Some of the really popular ones are Glamorous, which is the nail paint, the lipstick, styled components, nail paint, face paint, they're really fast, so I put a lightning thing. They've all been around for at least a year now. They've all sort of learnt from one another and have come up with really elegant, nice APIs around how you use them, around the patterns, and every release they sort of grab a few features off one another. And it's really exciting. So how it looks, if we start with just, we'll use Emotion because Emotion has the APIs of both Glamorous and styled components, which is really handy. So you'd import that into wherever you're using it. You'd write some CSS inside of your JS. Now you can either, with most frameworks, you can either use template strings like this, or you can use the object style like this. You're pretty much doing the same thing here. It's just whichever one you feel more comfortable with. And then you would add that so apply those styles to whatever piece of HTML you're targeting. You wouldn't use it without a framework, I don't think, like this, where you're just directly adding styles onto a structure that who knows. So let's have a look at that with a framework. Again, we just pull this in from React Emotion because it's got the API compat across most frameworks. You have these things called component factories, which just take sort of whatever tag or component you want to apply styling to, and then take some styles for that particular component. This is really handy with frameworks like React and Vue and Preact and all the other ones out there because it lets you then, then use it like here where you just throw that component into your template structure and it's got all those styles applied and you don't really have to think about how that's getting into either the head on a server-side render or if you're doing some sort of client-side navigation or some style changing has changed because you've selected to add something to the cart. You don't have to think about how that gets applied. It just all happens for you. And then you can just sort of apply class names as well. So you can generate some CSS which will get attached to a class name. And you really just don't have to think about too much with it. And yeah, you can do most things with it. If you've come from Sass or similar, it will feel very familiar if you're using the template string style. And with object string style, it's pretty much the same as well. You can have regular selectors, you can have contextual selectors where the ampersand's just being replaced with sort of a reference to that component. You can have contextual selectors with other components. It's just a template string, so you can export that class name from that component file, import it here and throw it into your CSS. And this way as well, if it changes in the other file, you've got a bit more safety around the fact that that's going to keep updated. You can do prop-based styling for where you've got frameworks like React where you have props flowing down through your templating. So as your state changes, those props will flow through, and in your styling, you will have things updated to reflect that. And yeah, you can do media queries, you can do nested styling, so contextual selectors under there. It does everything you're used to. So that's the API side of things. It's really nice to write, really useful, very handy. Lets you. It's very flexible, but also plays well if you've got quite rigid structure around how you do things with your application. So one of the other benefits is when it comes to testing, it gives you so much confidence. Lets you write code that's so maintainable, because if you break something by mistake, it will show up in your tests really fast. So one level of that is CSS snapshotting. So generally with your UI snapshots, whatever templating framework you're using, you'll be able to get your markup quite easily. And that may or may not include the class names, depending on what you're using. And the class names don't really give you a lot of information around the style rules. With CSS snapshotting, because CSS-in-js, you're generating your CSS at the same time as your markup, you get to have all your CSS in your snapshot. And if you accidentally change something, that'll show up for you locally, but also as part of peer review, be it GitHub, Bitbucket, or whatever sort of peer review tool you're using. Somebody else is going to see that and go, wait a second, you didn't mean to make that text alignment change. Go back and change that. Really handy, but that can lead to snapshots for where you've got a collection of different components. We had them with, I think, 1,000+ lines in one. It gets enormous. So really noisy, but people still look at it and people still pick up bugs. What's really, really awesome with it is visual snapshotting. It lets you set up visual snapshotting so fast, so easily, where you can throw a combination of Jest and Puppeteer and have your snapshots generated every time you run your tests. And here, so you can't really see any difference here visually. So if the traditional way you test things, you've gone in and you've just eyeballed, and you may have eyeballed side to side, but you've probably just eyeballed to make sure that they're both correct. Here on the left, on the bottom, the text, sponsored text. So just there, it's a little bit too low. And so this snapshot has picked that up. And you've got that in your Bitbucket or your GitHub. And it's not going to sneak through anymore. So that's awesome. So this image is courtesy of Mandy. Thank you for that. Critical CSS. So I've talked about it a bit before. If you don't know what that is, it's the ability for a system to extract and inline styles in the head that are required for that current page, and no more, no less. So, no 3 CSS files that, one's for your app, one's for your component library, one's for this other component you've got over there. It's just with a whole bunch of class names and, only 5% that you're probably actually using. With CSS-in-js, you're only ever going to, depending on how you set it up, you'll only ever have the CSS that you need for that particular page in the head, which is incredibly performant. When we relaunched Perth Now, our page size went up a teensy bit, but our time to first paint just totally disappeared. It was tremendous. So critical CSS, fantastic. You can do it with CSS-in-js. Trends. So it's awesome. It's really nice to write. It fits in with most ways of writing JS, whatever framework you're using. It's really great to test. But does it have traction? Yes. This is NPM trends over the last year. NPM downloads, they're not an entirely accurate metric. You've got a lot of build systems out there that are doing downloads. But generally, you can get a feel for, if there's uptake. And across all the different frameworks there, those are just some of the more popular ones. There's so many more out there. They're all doing reasonably well. Of course, should be clear, they're still tiny compared to Node.js. There's still a lot more people using CSS loaders and Node.js to do their CSS. But if you add up all those ones down at the bottom, you're actually almost a third, maybe half. If somebody wants to add that up, that'd be great. And it's got a lot of traction, whereas Node SAS is kind of stagnated. But also, I didn't grab the screenshot, something that's really healthy about it. If you go to their GitHub projects pages and you have a look at the activity hub, they give you the activity in form of sort of PRs in the last month, issues, how often they're being responded to, how many collaborators there are. They are all so healthy, the CSS and JS ones, compared to Node SAS. So much more activity, in many ways because it's new and it's still developing, but yeah, it's quite exciting, a lot of people using it. Also, there's a lot of local community uptake. If you were to take it on, the Fenders community has a bunch of people now who are using it. The JavaScript channel on there often has chatter around how do you do this, how do you do that with it. If you ever hit up into any problems, you can hit up that channel. Here's some quotes from some local community members. Carl Brightman, CSS in JS for the win. It works and you can get CSS from it when you need. Great endorsement. Patrick, I started writing CSS in JS in my dreams and I love it. Mandy, I love Glamorous, loving the simplicity of managing my CSS and the involvement of the wider team. And Ben, hard to think of a way to describe it other than I really like it. And there's a bunch more on the Slack channel, which sadly got added after this slide was locked. So if you want to see some other wonderful quotes, people talking about it in glowing terms, check out the Fenders JavaScript channel. But is it right for you? So CSS in JS, it's still a bit of a sort of controversial and somewhat delicate topic. Definitely promote having an open mind around it, but you've really just got to ask, will it improve your workflow? Because in the end, that's really the only thing that matters. Use the tools that are going to make you happier and more productive. And will it improve your workflow? Oh, sorry. So probably, because to summarize some of the things I've touched on here, you'll only be serving critical CSS, so performance-wise, that's tremendous. Also, you get minified class names and deduped styles, which is really hard to do with other CSS ways of doing things outside of JS CSS. It also gives you a lot of confidence in your code base and your styles that you may not have otherwise with things like unit level visual regression testing and also integration level visual regression testing, and also the CSS snapshotting, obviously. It lets your team, if you've got a team with people with great experience in JavaScript and then other people with great experience in CSS, lets them work together really well and come up with some great patterns. And also your domain experts in the CSS side of things are able to work to set up components or easier ways of interacting with the CSS, which make it harder for the JS people to go in and break everything, which is wonderful. And it just gets wider team engagement in your styling and your CSS. And I keep saying, sometimes they say CSS, sometimes they say styling. It's CSS in JS, but a lot of these frameworks actually let you target React Native or Sketch or other things that it's not necessarily CSS running. It makes component-based dev a lot easier. You don't have class name misspellings anymore, and CSS misspellings, they are a lot harder to happen with some of the type safety and linting tools available, and you avoid specificity issues with CSS as part of the actual solution. So without process, without naming conventions, without all of that. Cool, so I'm Luke John. You can find me on Twitter at Luke_John. As Amy said, I am shortly leaving Perth to head to London. So see you, Fenders. And I've got a couple of examples here that I haven't loaded up because you'll see in a moment. They're just a right. They're just an implementation of this one, but just using CSS in JS. So at the top there, we do use the object style for some styles, add that. Then we use the template string styles, do that. Do a bit more template strings. You can do things like keyframes as well. There's helpers set up for that to make that a bit easier. And you can also, all those wonderful things you have in Sass, like RGBA and whatnot, there's a brilliant framework called Polished, which has just about all of them. They work pretty much the same way, except in JS, how you'd expect them. So I'll just close that one, because you wouldn't, that one was just sort of directly manipulating things. You'd probably be using it with a framework. So you'd be doing something more like this. So you inject some global CSS with it. And then split things out. This is actually still going directly. I tried to do it with React, but that memory leak kept crashing it. So that's not there. It also unlocks some really, so this is just an example of how you do it with React. But if you go into there, you can just share things around really easily across that. So that was for a thingamabob. And you can create all sorts of really handy helpers. So this one just sort of counts around some pixels. Yeah, pretty much anything you can do in Sass, you can do in there. So yeah, thank you very much all.